Well, good evening, everybody. I'm making a bit of a habit of standing up and talking about survey results, aren't I? Anyway, I think the results are really interesting, and 124 of you responded to the survey that went out with the invitations to this event. You were asked to answer 5 questions relating to net positive, to understand what your views were, your level of understanding, what some of the strengths and weaknesses with net positive were. I've just noticed the colour scheme doesn't quite fit with the EY brand, but clearly the yellow comes out as blue, but that's fun. Can I have the next slide, please? I don't know who's... I'm in charge. Here we go. I don't think it's moving, though, is it? Oh, there we go. Thank you. Audience participation. Yes, it is! Okay, so the first question was to understand what your level of understanding was as to what net positive was. And I guess, encouragingly, the majority of you were familiar with the term net positive and generally had a positive view of what it meant. So everybody was asked to either highlight one or more of these questions, and 54% of you felt that net positive is the natural next step in sustainability strategies. And almost 70% of you felt net positive represented a shift in focus beyond operational control to recognizing the impact and influence of an organization on society. So it's very much looking from the inside initially, but looking out. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So, in terms of their ability to motivate the mainstream, we asked you how good net positive was as a term at engaging functions within your organizations that don't typically engage with environmental and social sustainability on a day-to-day basis. And overall, with regard to net positive, over 70% of you thought that it was a term that was either effective or highly effective at motivating the mainstream. But there were other terms that were considered to be just as effective, if not more effective. For example, reducing impact was one of those. I was quite surprised, though, in relation to sustainable value creation and decoupling impact from growth. I was expecting there to be a more sort of positive understanding as to how effective those terms would be, because actually those are probably more common terms that are used to describe many of our clients' sustainability strategies, and yet they're not considered to be that effective at engaging the mainstream. I do apologize for the colours on these. They do seem to have come out a bit odd, but hopefully you're following it in terms of the legend underneath. So the next question is, we wanted to ask you what you felt were the main strengths of a net positive strategy. And there were 2 key ones that really came out from this. And over 90% of you felt that these were key strengths. The first of those 2 was it shifts the focus beyond operational impacts to full value creation. This view that net positive covers the full value chain was one thing that came out very clear from the survey. And then secondly, that it allows sustainability programs to be set in the context of business growth. This isn't just about environmental performance improvement. Often, the understanding of net positive is that it represents strengths in terms of how it represents a positive benefit for business growth. Okay, so moving on to the next question. You also recognise that there were challenges in the delivery of a net positive strategy, but also challenges in the understanding of it. And whilst you all agreed that these were challenges, there were 2 that really stood out from this. The first was the actual definition. What does net positive mean? And actually having an appropriate definition of net positive was something that you felt was really important. And the other really important challenge that was recognised was measurement. The need to have robust measurement around net positive strategies. And one of the things I did is I looked at some of the additional points that were made underpinning some of your responses. And under measurement, the highlights were, how can you measure the impact of a change in society and the challenge associated with that, which is often an ambition as part of a net positive strategy? Or how do you measure the change in impact in your supply chain when you're not responsible for it? Those were two key challenges that came out from here. One that isn't highlighted here in the initial instance was somebody wrote in their response, which I thought was a really important one. A challenge they felt was, well, okay, if the focus is going to be on the full value chain, does this mean there's going to be less focus on managing operational risks and operational impact? And I think that's really important in terms of both the definition, but also how net positive strategies are implemented, that the impacts associated with the core are not forgotten. I thought that was a really important thing that was raised. Okay, and then we got on to, well, what would a legitimate net positive strategy include in terms of scope? And I guess there are three standout components here, which is probably not surprising. So impacts of supply chain, impacts of products and services, and impacts of operations. So, you know, a very significant number of you also highlighted that legitimate considerations for inclusion within a net positive strategy were also the influence that organizations can have on both business partners but other third parties. But just down the bottom, to draw your attention, we asked the question about whether offsetting impacts was a legitimate part of a net positive strategy. And about 40% of you thought that they were a legitimate part. But in the notes to that, a number of people said, well, yeah, okay, if offsetting generally related to the full spectrum of impacts, that might play a role. But in this case, in most cases, offsetting only relates to certain impacts. And as a result of that, they felt that it probably didn't play an important part in a net positive strategy. Okay, so those are the questions that you answered. I guess when I went through these results, I sort of thought, well, are these surprising results? And I guess they weren't. They were probably the ones that I was expecting. Net positive is clearly a term that you're all very familiar with. It's a term and an ambition that I think most of you get and are encouraged by. But you're also presenting the gauntlet down and saying, if you're going to do this properly, there are some pretty fundamental challenges that need to be addressed. And the two biggies being, well, how do you actually define it? What are you trying to achieve? But also, how do you measure it and actually demonstrate that you are achieving net benefit? Thank you very much for your time.